feel like my outfit screams adjunct professor who's trying way too hard to get on the tenure track. Friends, it is a good day for tea. Every day is a good day for tea. My partner and I went yesterday to the Celestial Tea Factory. It's not too far from where we live, and we took a tour of the premises and had a all-around good time. We treated ourselves to some tea, which ironically is not what I'm drinking now because I wanted lemon ginger and we didn't buy lemon ginger yesterday. It is a good day for tea, but more importantly, it's a good day for books. It's always a good day for books. Today, we are talking about the 7 books I read in January. I thought it would be fun to go through those together and just kind of talk through my thoughts. This will be the first time I'm actually sitting down to really dig into books, because the other videos I've done before this have either been cursory glances or, kind of briefly discussing things, but not really getting into the meat and potatoes of things. So I will generally keep my thoughts spoiler-free. If I'm going to talk about spoilers for a book, I'll let you know, but there may be instances where I want to talk specifics that might spoil someone who hasn't read it. You'll be warned. But hello, welcome back. My name is Gala. If you're new here, thank you for stopping by. We like to talk about books here, and we're going to do so today, so I hope you enjoy your time. So first book I read this year was The Awakening by Kate Chopin. I know many people probably have read this one. I've never read Kate Chopin before. This also included several short stories of hers. Hit and miss. I'm going to kind of leave those out of this conversation and just talk about The Awakening because some of those short stories were decent, but to tell you the truth, I don't remember them well enough to really speak to them, and I'm just going to keep this conversation to The Awakening today. This was fantastic and a really nice way to start the year. I started this on New Year's Day. My partner and I just sat down to read side by side. I really, really had a good time with this. The Awakening is about a woman named Edna who comes to an awakening in her life. And I don't want to spoil anything. I think this book is really worth going into spoiler-free. It's a very subtle and pared-back read. It's not the kind of thing that shocks you, but the revelations for the reader as well as for Edna, the main character, are so poignant and so powerful in their subtlety that they're really just beautifully crafted. I really love the way this book plays with memory and nostalgia and the things that we don't even know we're missing out on because we never knew they existed in the first place. There's a huge theme of longing and unspoken regret, and the way that we navigate relationships and romantic relationships most importantly, and how they affect our sense of self-worth and how we perceive ourselves in relation to society, how we perceive ourselves in relation to nature and the natural world. It's really beautiful, and she uses this idea of an awakening to sort of mean that a character is awakening into a world that they weren't awake in yesterday. They were, for all intents and purposes, asleep, and they didn't know that they were asleep. That's kind of the crux of the whole thing, is not even realizing that you were asleep, that you were dreaming, that you weren't awake in your true life as your true self. And this is a really big feminist read. I know Kate Chopin, based on the biographical information in this book, was sort of shut down for this book when it came out. She was doing well successfully, and when this came out, it did not do well. People did not like it. Men and women alike. No one thought this was good at the time that it came out. And this came out in 1899, right at the turn of the century. She was really lambasted for such a feminist read that this was. And it really is a feminist read, but I think it can be beneficial to anyone. I think you can really take away from this regardless of who you are. And there's so much to be said about the idea of that awakening, that idea of waking up to be a self that you didn't know that you were missing out on. And I think the beauty of this book is I can relate to this in the sense of waking up to understand things that you didn't understand yesterday and experiencing different triggers in the natural world to sort of cause that awakening to begin and the stirrings in your soul. I think the best thing about this book to me is you can understand what Edna is going through. I think anyone can understand what Edna is going through, but you can't truly understand it because everyone's awakening is such a personal experience. So Edna is, she thinks she's one person until she realizes that she's been lying to herself and she's been lying to the world because she wasn't being her genuine self. And that is an experience or an idea that I think many or anybody can relate to. But her unique experience is, I don't think, something that anyone can fully latch onto. Even if your life was exactly like Edna's and everything that happened to you was exactly the same things that happened to Edna, it's that understanding of what it means to awaken into another idea of yourself or a different version of yourself. That is different for everyone. That is unique to every person. So my experiences are different, and my understanding of what an awakening means is different from Edna, is different from you, is different from your mother or your brother or your sister or your best friend. It's different for everyone, and that's what's so beautiful about this to me, is this is one woman's story, but it's so relatable to anyone. And again, that idea of an awakening is a personal experience that no one can replicate. Even if you experience the exact same sequence of events, it's unique to you, and you can't really explain that. And I think I like that so much because this whole book, we don't really focus in on Edna's thoughts too much. We kind of see the world through her eyes and what she's experiencing and how different people talk about her. But it's not so much that we're looking at this and reading about, like, Edna thought this, Edna wondered about this. Like, that does happen, but most of the perception of Edna comes through how she relates to other characters and how other characters talk and think about her. And so you kind of see this image of her before her awakening and after her awakening through the lens of other people's perspectives. And that's why it's so cool to me, because, again, you can't understand anyone else's awakening because it's so personal and so unique to everyone. I really love that idea that, like, we don't necessarily learn about the awakening through her eyes. It's completely, I shouldn't say completely, it's primarily through the perspectives of others, and we just kind of watch Edna going along through these different experiences and motions and emotions until she ends up on the other side as a different person. It's beautiful. I can't recommend this enough. I'm sure a lot of people in the comments have probably read this. Please let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts about this, if you agree or disagree, because I thought this was beautiful. And I think there's more I could say about this, but I'm just going to kind of leave it there because I don't want to get into spoiler territory. Man, my throat dries out after like 10 minutes of talking. Good thing I got this tea, though. It's always a good day for tea. Next up was The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony by Roberto Calasso. This is one of the best books I've ever read, and I can already tell you this is going to end up on my favorite books of the year. This blew me the heck away. In case you hadn't noticed by my like 90 marks on this book, I don't even know where to begin. This is a retelling and telling and retelling and telling and retelling of Greek myth. Why do I say that ad nauseum? Because I think Roberto Calasso understands Greek myth better than probably anyone else alive today. He has read everything probably 10 times inside and out, knows it like the back of his hand, and he put this book together in the most incredible way I think I've ever seen. Let me give an example. The first chapter is about 24-25 pages long. He goes through every major instance of the bull in Greek mythology. He talks about how the symbol of the bull, the image of the bull, the presence of the bull, and the mythological context of the bull interweave themselves through so many different myths, and how they affect different characters, how they relate to different gods, how different gods, demigods, take the appearance of a bull, how they interact with humans, right? It's just that for like 25 pages. That on its own, that one chapter I would probably say is going to be one of the best things I've read this year, because it's so interesting and so intricate, and he knows so much in the way of how to relate different pieces of myth and context and culture to each other. So that one chapter is about bulls in Greek myth. He then takes that one chapter and moves on to the next chapter. So the second chapter opens up talking about Dionysus and goes on for a long time talking about Dionysus. And then it shifts to something entirely different. Structurally, this is one of the finest things I've ever read. Every chapter is like a puzzle box, and every piece of the puzzle box comes together into the book to form an even larger puzzle box. So he'll have chapters where he talks about, I'm not kidding, like 15 different distinct, unique things. And you ask yourself, how do these things even come together? Like, he'll have a section where he's talking about Dionysus, let's say, and the Bacchantes who follow him, right? And then he'll transition into like a story of Zeus takes the form of an eagle. And you're like, what does this have to do with anything? And then in the middle of that Zeus-eagle digression, he'll take another digression to start talking about like some lady And you're like, I don't even know who this is. But then all of a sudden, it all just clicks that this lady relates to the Zeus Eagle myth, and the Zeus Eagle myth relates to the original Bacchanite story, and it all just like, at some point in the middle of the work, just, you realize that all of these things connect together. You have to let yourself go down the train, is I guess what I'm trying to say. You have to let him make these digressions, because when you get into the heart of the digressions, you realize that all of these different digressions connect together so interestingly and intricately and seamlessly that you couldn't have seen it before unless you know so much about Greek myth like Calasso does, that allowing him to go down these rabbit holes elucidates the most interesting connections I think I've ever seen in my life. I'm not exaggerating. This is incredible. It's so hard to explain because every chapter will have like 10 digressions that all come together to form this larger thing, and then you go to the next chapter and he just starts talking about something entirely different, has 10 new digressions, but it still builds on the other work. Like, I think you could read any chapter of this book in isolation and find it interesting and engaging and not need further context. But when you put all these chapters in succession, they become something greater, because, you know, let's say like the second chapter talks about Dionysus and the third chapter talks about Zeus. When you get to the fourth chapter, he'll reference the bull myths, and you already know about those because those were in chapter 1. He'll reference things about Dionysus he elucidated in chapter 2. You can follow the train, and you don't need that context to follow any specific chapter, but the way the chapters build on each other is just so gorgeous. And the way he builds this information out is so gorgeous. And the reason I love it so much is because he's really at the heart talking about the function of myth in Greek culture and in our world today. His whole idea, he gives about 10 different definitions of myth over the course of this book, and every one of them is as interesting as the last, and every one of them makes so much sense. But he's talking about myth as this force, almost, right? The way that gods and humans interact with each other and relate to each other over thousands of stories, just in Greek culture, the way that those myths affect Greek culture, affected it then and affect it now, the way that we still think about myth today, all of these different symbols, like the bull, how we perceive them in Greek culture, how we would think about these things in our context today, right? He doesn't so much delve into the here and now, but you can make your own connections, because as you read, there's just so much, there's so much going through my brain. Again, it's why I have like almost 100 tabs in this book from a single read through, because there's so many interesting things he's talking about here. The way he kind of dissects myth is all in the structure of the book. That's why I love it so much. I love nothing more than a book whose structure mirrors the idea of the content, right? Because myth being this, you know, multi-layered thing that you can't really just say this is what myth is, because it's so many things at the same time. Like I said, he's got about 10 different definitions of myth that are all interesting and correct and engaging, and none of them is more important than the other because they're all so important. Myth as this thing that you can't quite piece together in one go, like, that's what this book is, right? That's what he's talking about, but that's how he structures the book, because it's so all over the place when you look at it in a broad context. Like the way he structures this book, like I was talking about before, there's so many digressions and so many things going on, but then you realize that all of these digressions connect to each other and paint a larger picture of those things that you didn't understand as well before. And then you move to a second chapter and you do the same thing, and then you read all 12 chapters of the book, and by the time you're done with it, you have not only so much greater of an understanding of Greek myth and Greek culture and Greek context and how these things shaped each other, how Greek culture shaped Greek myth and how Greek myth shaped Greek culture, you not only understand these things so much better, it elucidates the fact that the structure of this book mirrors the idea of myth, right? Because myth is this thing you can't understand. It's larger than life. Literally, it's about the gods. You can't really fathom these things. So when you put those ideas into the structure of the book, you come out with it with seriously one of the best things I think I've ever read. I cannot recommend this highly enough. I don't even really like the idea of recommending books because I'm not you and you're not me, and I like what I like and you like what you like. So maybe you won't like this book, but if you have any inkling of an interest in Greek myth, do yourself a favor and read this book, because it's breathtaking. I don't know what else to say. It's just so amazingly good. Please check this out if you have any interest at all. And I've been getting a lot more interested in Greek myth recently, in Greek culture, and I'm kind of trying to get a lot more into historical reads as well. So this was sort of a precursor for me to get really excited about reading more about Greek culture and Greek myth. I'm gonna try and pick up a lot more plays and tragedies and classic works like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, because I want to just learn more. But this is so cool, because even as someone who doesn't really know a lot about Greek myth, I could understand everything he was saying. I got so much out of this. It's just so good. I don't know what else to say. Please check it out. I wrote in my notes after I finished the book, I wrote to myself, "Each chapter is a seemingly disparate web of connotations that blossom before your eyes into a harmony of colors, shapes, personages, and each chapter can be read in isolation, but in sequence they build upon each other so masterfully that the structure of the whole world elucidates itself as the finest spiral of brick up the side of a high tower." I was waxing poetic. That's how you know I like this book so much. Next up is Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf. If you've watched any of my other videos, you'll probably know by now that I love Hermann Hesse. And this was a reread for me. This is about a man named Harry Haller who is not happy with his life, and he hasn't been happy with his life for a long time. He is depressed, he has no one, and he moves into a boarding house with an aunt and her nephew, and the story is told through the lens of a testament that Harry put down in writing that is now being recounted to us. If you've read any Hermann Hesse before, you kind of know what he's doing, because he does a lot of similar things with all of his books. He's very cerebral, he's very methodical, and the way he tells a story, it can almost seem boring from the outset. I love his writing personally, and I think his prose is beautiful. The way he structures his books is very much about the inner workings of the mind of your main character, or characters in some cases, and how those characters are navigating the world and learning more about themselves. They're very often, you can kind of say Bildungsroman, but this guy's like 50 years old. They're not really the young coming of age stories very often, but it sort of fits the mold at the same time. But they are very, in a similar way to The Awakening that I was talking about earlier, they often are about characters coming to these cerebral awakenings, coming to different understandings of themselves and the world in relation to nature as well, right? Like Siddhartha, which I've talked about before, is about a man trying to learn to live in harmony and context with himself in society and in nature, right? That's a very common theme in his novels. This one is less about the nature side of things and more about how this man, Harry Haller, who is past his prime, he's, in the later stages of his life, and he's just so unhappy with himself and the world around him. He's misanthropic, to use the best term for the context. It's really about the way he is trying to understand himself in relation to these things and how he can kind of come to terms with these things. This book is despairing, to say the least. Harry is going through a lot, and he's trying to understand himself, but he makes certain connections with a young woman and a young man that sort of pull him away from the brink of despair and try and show him what it means to live his life again and live to the fullest and not think about these things so greatly. But he makes certain promises, and he makes certain choices through these connections that lead him down a path that is simultaneously darker than he experienced before and more illuminating and more hopeful than he could have ever imagined. It's so beautiful. God, I love this book so much. I guess I should actually say, because I didn't even touch on the title, Steppenwolf. He is a man who sort of sees himself in these alternate personas. One as a man who wants to be this good and strong and powerful beacon of light and hope in society for humanity, and on the other hand, a wolf of the steppes. That's the Steppenwolf, who's snarling and cackling and wicked and vile, and he sees this as the side of him that brings out the worst in him. So the man, Harry Haller, is that light and that goodness, and the wolf of the steppes, the Steppenwolf, is that kind of wickedness in him, and he sees this struggle in a balance of power between the two pieces of himself. On one hand, he's trying to win out and have Harry Haller, the good and the light, come and win this struggle, but on the other hand, he's so despairing that he almost wants to give up and let the wolf take over. And there are many scenes in the book where he allows the Steppenwolf to take control and do these wicked things or say these terrible things to people who don't deserve them. And on the one hand, he wants to stop this, but on the other hand, he gives up to this sort of defeatist mentality. It's beautiful, and the book talks about this duology of self and explodes it in this beautiful way to say there aren't two versions of the self, there are an infinite versions of the self living inside all of us, and he really has to explore what those versions mean and how they relate to the Harry version and the Steppenwolf version, and how all of these things have to exist in harmony within us to be a person. It's beautiful. Please check this out if you haven't. Next up, I read Beowulf. It's a Month for Wolves, back to back. This was also a reread, but I haven't read this in like over a decade. It's been a really long time. But the first time I read it was the famous Seamus Heaney version. This was a Michael Alexander translation, so I wanted to just give it a different go. I found this cheap. It's a Penguin classic, so it's good stuff. I wanted to give it a try in a different universe translation this time and just see how it went. I would say the only gripe I have with this book is that it doesn't have the side-by-side, like Old English on the left and the translation on the right. It is just the new translation of the book. It's okay. I really like the Seamus Heaney version, not only because the translation is really good, but also because it has that side-by-side of the Old English and the translation on the other side of the page. I really like having that comparison. I can't really compare the two translations because, again, I haven't read this in over like a decade, so I can't say I really remember the Seamus Heaney translation well enough. If I choose to read this again, I would like to get that version and kind of compare it side by side with this. Nonetheless, Beowulf is the oldest surviving, I think, Old English like poetry or epic poem or verse. I think there are older existing pieces of Old English literature or writing in general, but this is the oldest like epic poetry or verse that exists from Old English. It is about a heroic man named Beowulf who slays several different creatures in epic heroic fashion and goes on to kind of live out this life. I don't know how people feel about this one because, again, I haven't read it in so long. It's really an interesting read because it's simultaneously kind of boring and structurally weak, but it has so many ideas that I find really intriguing and engaging at the same time. He has sort of three major fight encounters in this epic poem. One is Grendel, one is Grendel's mother, and the last is a dragon. And you sort of go through the first portion of the book, and it goes through these first two fights in like a general sequence, and you follow this whole thing, and then all of a sudden it just cuts like 50 years and now he's like way older and he's gonna fight a dragon, and we skip his whole life. And I think there's something to be said for that time jump and what it does structurally in the book, but it is a bit jarring if you've never read this before or you don't know it's coming. I don't have a problem with it, but again, there's something to the structure of this book that it's weird. The time jump feels jarring, but at the same time it feels natural because we're following this story of a hero, and there are other people called heroes in the book, mainly Hrothgar, an old king that Beowulf comes to the aid of to assist in defeating these foes that have been terrorizing their hall for so many years now. He comes to their aid, and this old man, this old king named Hrothgar, who is a hero, or he was a hero in his time, he's not strong enough to stand up to the foes that terrorize his people now, and Beowulf comes to help and he wins the day. But this idea of hero is kind of the most interesting piece of the story to me, because Michael Alexander points out in his introductory material to this book that the idea of a hero in this context is not just someone who slays the foe or slays the monster. It is that, but more than anything, it's a person who fights for his flock, right? It's someone who stands up for the people who need protecting. And that's not like a crazy unheard of idea for a hero or the archetype of a hero, but he really stresses that the glory in the heroic act is not the glory of slaying the foe, it's the glory in protecting the people who need protecting, which I like that a lot. I think that's a really interesting context or perception of a hero. And Hrothgar, this old king, who is still labeled as a great hero, even in the time that Beowulf comes to help him, he's not strong enough anymore to protect his people. So he's a failing hero, not because he can't defeat the foe, but because he can't protect his people. The protection aspect is the most important one. So Beowulf comes in and he is able to protect these people by slaying the foe. It's cool. I like that a lot. And the way that this idea of a hero really plays into the final act in the story of a dragon, there are riches to be won, but what they choose to do with those riches really goes simultaneously counter but in line with what it means to these people to be a hero. And I won't spoil all of this. If you want to read this, please do. It's not a very long read. You can definitely sit down and read this in like a single sitting if you want to just kind of plow through it. because it is verse and you can really move your way through it. I can't, again, say that I recommend the Michael Alexander version or the Seamus Heaney version. I would say probably pick up the Seamus Heaney version because it is lauded as the best one, and chances are if I reread that I would probably find it better than this one. It just is what it is, but this was not a bad version to pick up. I think my only other gripe with this book is there isn't a lot of beneficial or useful notation on the poem, like throughout the read. Like there is a notation section at the end, right? But most of that notation, it's not very illuminating. It doesn't really say very much. And I think it's because Michael Alexander's introduction was really good, and he kind of just said all he had to say in the introduction, and then there was like sort of nothing left to say in the notation. It's okay. Either way, I definitely enjoyed this as a reread. It's been a long time, and it was definitely worth picking back up again. Kind of in line with what I was reading earlier, with the marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. I am really interested in myth and how it plays into the development of culture and civilization. So I'm kind of just interested in reading more myth in general. If you have, for that matter, any myth recommendations or any Greek myth or Greek history or culture recommendations for me, please leave them in the comments below. I would love to hear what you have to say because I'm really trying to get more into this. I'm really, really enjoying this kind of reading recently. The last thing I'll say about this is they really talk about how the monsters in this book are descendants of Cain and how they bear the mark of Cain. And there's a really interesting religious read in this book as well. It's coming from an anonymous writer, I should say. We don't know who wrote Beowulf, but it was written in a Christian context for characters who are non-Christian, because these are like Danish and Scandinavian characters from Scandinavian countries who wouldn't have been Christian at the time. If as long as I'm understanding this correctly, please correct me if I'm not. But these are like non-Christian characters being written by a Christian writer who use Christian context and like allegory and association and praise God all of the time. It's really interesting because that's not historically what these people would have been worshiping or thinking or doing. They would have had their own set of gods. So I really like that read, and I like the kind of blending of culture and religion. And I think it says a lot about not only the spread of Christianity, right, throughout this time, but also the way that different allegory can still mean so much when you take it out of its original context. Because the mark of Cain, for anyone who doesn't know, it's a biblical thing, right? Like Cain and Abel were the first two sons of Adam and Eve. Cain kills Abel. So anyone who is a descendant of Cain bears the mark of Cain, the mark of wickedness. If you're a descendant of Abel, you don't have that wickedness. And then there's like Ham and Shem and stuff, and I don't remember all of that. No, those are the sons of Noah? Never mind. I'm mixing my biblical contexts here. Forget what I said. The monsters in this book bear the mark of Cain, and it is a really interesting interplay of religion and society in different cultures over history. Next up, I reread Catcher in the Rye. This was a month for rereads for me. I have a couple books on the shelf that I haven't read since I was just like a teenager, and I wanted to reread quite a few of these. Like Huckleberry Finn, I love that book, and I haven't read it in a long time, probably over a decade now too. Would really like to reread that. But I decided to pick up Catcher in the Rye. It's the only Salinger I've read. I think it resonates for a lot of teenagers for obvious reasons. It's about a boy named Holden Caulfield who is getting kicked out of his sort of private boarding school, and he has to go home. He doesn't want to tell his parents that he got kicked out because it's not the first time it's happened. He's antisocial, to say the least, and he has a lot of issues connecting with people in social interactions, and he's awkward and frustrated and stressed, and he hates everyone. And it's a really relatable book for a lot of teenagers, kind of for the obvious aforementioned reasons. As a teenager, I read this in school when I was so much younger, and I liked it at the time, and I connected with it probably like a lot of teenagers do. I know a lot of people don't like this book or think Holden is a jerk, and he is, right? I don't know specifically what a lot of the criticism is for this book. I will say that I was curious to see what I would think about Catcher in the Rye after not reading it for so long and being in my mid-20s, to see what I thought about a book like this now. I liked it. I probably just as much as before, maybe more. And there's a lot to say about this character. I think he's 16 going on 17 or 15 going on 16. It resonates so well for so many teenagers because you can really connect wordlessly to the experience Holden is having without really needing to, again, wordlessly, without needing to explain too much. He's angsty, he's frustrated, he thinks no one understands him, right? Like these are really common sentiments for teenagers, and I'm sure I felt these things at the time too. I did, but I don't necessarily feel these things now. But the way the book portrays him and the struggles he's going through, I think anyone can connect to these things. I can still connect to these things. I think some of the criticism for this book is he is a spoiled, selfish and non-understanding, like, white teenager in America who he's just angsty and he's frustrated. Why should I care about the things he's going through? In a certain sense, I do understand that read, and Lord knows we need less, narratives about white people in our day and age. But I think that misses the mark because it's not incorrect, right? But it's just paring it down to the bare bones and not really listening to what the book has to say. He's not just an angsty and frustrated kid, right? There are specific reasons why he's frustrated. There are specific reasons why he's sad and lonely and depressed, right? There are the obvious ones, like, well, he's a virgin and there's pressure at his age to, right, have sex, and there is a scene where he, hires a sex worker to come to his room and all he wants to do is talk, right? There's, and there are, consequences from there, and he kind of gets screwed over for that situation in a way that seems ridiculous and unfair. There are other situations where he has good intentions, but bad things come out of it. There are situations where he has bad intentions and bad things come out of it. And in a certain sense, you're like, Holden, what do you expect? And deep down, it seems like he knows that he shouldn't expect good things to come from his negativity. But it's so hard for him to not be negative because he's cast in this place where he just feels like no one understands him. And it's self-perpetuating, right? The famous word everybody would say about this book is phony. He calls everybody he doesn't like and who he thinks is false a phony. The problem that Holden is facing is that he's the phony, right? Everyone around him is also a phony, arguably just like he says. But the problem is that Holden is also a phony, and he's scared. He's scared that if he lets his guard down, he will realize that he is a phony, because he knows it deep down. He knows that he's just as phony and just as fake as everyone else, but he doesn't want to admit it, so he calls everyone else a phony as a defense mechanism. He's going through so much, and this is a minor spoiler warning, so if you don't want to learn about this, I guess, skip a couple seconds ahead, but his brother Ali was killed a couple of years ago. He was younger than Holden, so he was just, I think he was like 10 or 11 years old or something like that. He was a young kid, and he gets killed, and Holden is dealing with these feelings, right? He's dealing with the aftermath and the understanding of his brother being gone now, and he can't cope with that, and that's a lot for anyone to cope with, let alone a teenager, right? Trying to go through so much and fit into social scenarios, and it's hard for him, understandably so. And I think to say that he's not a sympathetic character would be disingenuous, and anyone who says he's not a sympathetic character, I think, is missing the point, or somehow has never lost a single person in their life. And I guess good for you. You're living a really lucky life if that's the case, but it catches up to everyone in the end, I'll say that much. And the things he's going through are so manifest in the way he talks about them and in his disingenuousness, because he's so fake in everything he says. The other thing you may know about this book is that it's written stream of consciousness, so everything comes from Holden's mouth, right? We're reading from his perspective. Anyway, that's what I was thinking about while I sat in that vomity looking chair in the lobby. Old Jane. Every time I got to that part about her out with Stradlater in that damn Ed Banky's car, it almost drove me crazy. I knew she wouldn't let him go to first base with her, but it drove me crazy anyway. I don't even like to talk about it, if you want to know the truth. That's the tone of the whole book. You're reading from his perspective, and I think I really appreciated this book on a reread. It is a fast and easy read, but it's also kind of heartbreaking at the same time to see this frustrated and depressed teenager going through so much with no one to understand him. And even the people in his life who should understand what he's going through with the loss of his brother, they don't seem to understand him. And there's a lack of adult authoritative presence in his life. And when he meets with these authoritative figures, he lashes out, or he doesn't want to, interact with them in that way. And I don't want to spoil what the title of the book means, The Catcher in the Rye, because it's an interesting thing in and of itself. So read the book if you want to learn more about that. But he wants to preserve the childhood within himself, and he wants to preserve childhood for as many people as possible. And in his immaturity and in his desire not to grow up and not to be a phony like he sees everyone else to be, he acts more a child than the other people around him, because he doesn't want to be this terrible grown-up that he thinks everyone else is gonna turn into. And he wants to preserve childhood for the children in his life, particularly his younger sister, Phoebe, because he wants her to have that childhood that Allie couldn't have because he's gone, right? And I don't know, I think it's beautiful. I think it's really simple in its way. And it's a really, really kind of easy and light read that says so much at the same time. So that's Catcher in the Rye. I definitely enjoyed rereading this. Next up, I read The Woman Warrior, A Girlhood Among Ghosts by Maxine Kingston. So this was sort of a reread. There are 5 stories in this collection. I had only read one of them, called White Tigers. The other 4 were completely new to me. So this is autobiographical for Kingston and biographical for her family and a lot of people that she knows. At its core, it's really focusing on the experience of Chinese women in China, Chinese women in America, and Chinese American women in America. And it does kind of do this breakdown because we learn about Kingston's mother when she lived in China. We learn about the mother when she lived in America, and we also learn a lot about Kingston herself as a Chinese American woman living in America. And I think that title, Memoirs of a Girlhood Among Ghosts, really says everything, and there's a lot to unpack with this book. This is a really, really interesting, and I think enriching is the best word I can use for it, read. In a similar way I was saying to the Calasso earlier, these stories really build upon each other and create a context and a world for the reader to dive into for Kingston and her mother and her family, and really parses through these different relationships and interactions in a really, really interesting and meaningful way. A lot of this book focuses in on myth too. Like there's Chinese myth interwoven in here. The one story I've read in here before, White Tigers, is a retelling of the story of Fa Mulan. You might have seen Mulan, the Disney film, before. Solid pick. But the retelling of Fa Mulan is sort of Kingston putting herself in the role of the woman warrior and retelling the story as if she was the one learning and living this life, training to be a warrior. It's really beautiful, and it's, I think, still probably the best story out of this collection. It's the only one I had read before, but I think it's still the best one walking away from this collection. And she weaves Chinese myth into the telling of these stories of her and her family, and how the myths of women and how the real lives of women intersect in meaningful and frightening ways, because there are stories that I won't get into here because I think this is worth reading, of members of Kingston's family that she never got to meet because they were in China before she was born, who dealt with some very harrowing things, had to go through certain experiences primarily because they were women that no one should have to experience. At a cursory glance, she talks about foot binding and how it affects and affected Chinese women. She talks about the roles women were expected to play in Chinese culture. She talks about the things that Chinese women were and were not supposed to do, and how certain members of her family were forced into situations that they were not responsible for and had to reap the consequences of these horrible things that happened to them. It's harrowing. And the first story of this book really delves into that. Later chapters, again, become more biographical and autobiographical and speak through the lens of Kingston herself, and some of them a sort of third-person omniscient talking about members of her family in different ways. And she really gets into the immigrant experience as well, and what it means to recode oneself culturally to another country, because so much of this book is about her mother's experience. And she spends a whole chapter talking about how her mother was a doctor in China. And even in that chapter, she weaves in myth and folklore and interactions in the way that this was just such a natural part of life for her mother in China. And she talks about how her mother was a licensed and certified doctor in China, but when she came to America, she can't be a doctor anymore because they don't recognize her degrees. And her family very stereotypically runs a laundry business. And there's so much to be said just in that idea alone. And I feel like this book, it's like 200 pages. Yeah, it's like 200 pages. This could be like so much longer. I could see this being an even further multi-generational epic in a certain sense, where I could see story upon story building out of this. It's such a beautiful book in the way that it layers out these sort of like roles of woman in family in China and in America, and how these, again, kind of like weave into different pieces of American and Chinese culture. From the title as well, A Girlhood Among Ghosts, she talks about, or I should say she doesn't talk about the idea of ghosts. She never explains really what ghosts mean to her, but she talks about them at length. Basically, everyone who is not a Chinese person or a Chinese American person is a ghost. Everyone, right? So there's the mailman ghost, there's the school teacher ghost, there's the gymnastics ghost, right? Everybody who is not a Chinese or Chinese American person, in her eyes as a child, is a ghost. It's such an interesting and poignant image and word to use because there are so many ghosts in her family's past that never left China because they were killed there, right? This a lot of this talks about, the Maoist revolution in China as well, and that's a lot of where her family is kind of situated before they come to America. She was born in America, but that's where a lot of the context for her family fleeing to America comes. And this idea of ghosts and people who you kind of see but can't see, right? Or these people see right through you. That's the idea that she's going for, and she never really explains it. She just kind of lets the word ghost speak for itself. And I think it does. It's such a strong word. And the idea of calling everyone else a ghost, and the idea that these people don't see her and that she doesn't quite see them, right? Like, it's such a powerful image. This haziness around the world, right? Even in the world that she was born into and grown up in California, in America. It's so powerful. There's so much more to unpack with this book. I've said so much already. I think I'm gonna leave it here. This was my second of her books. I've read Tripmaster Monkey before, and I have Chinamen on the shelf as well. She primarily writes and wrote nonfiction. Tripmaster Monkey is her one book of fiction, if I understand. That one was okay. I read that last year. But I would highly recommend this if you're interested in kind of anything I was just talking about. This is really, really beautiful, and I'm very curious to read more of her in Chinamen because, yeah, she is just such a powerful writer. I don't think this is a perfect book, and I think some of the stories kind of work better than others, and some of them are a little too long, and you sort of lose interest in them, but on the whole, it's a really, really great collection. Really great collection. And the last book I read in January was Across the River and Into the Trees by Ernest Hemingway. This was my second Hemingway. The first one I've read is Men Without Women, and I've read this twice, and I think there are some really solid stories in this collection, but this I just found really quick at like a Goodwill for $1 or $2 recently, and I figured I'd just give it a try because I've always wanted to read more of him, and I didn't recognize this title because, it's not the Movable Feasts or For Whom the Bell Tolls or Old Man in the Seas, right? I didn't know this one, but I figured I'd give it a go because he's so highly regarded. This was not completely strong to me. I think I need to try some of the other ones. Tit for Tat, it's okay, right? I didn't hate this book, and I think the cover it's pretty, but overall this book is kind of not on the beautiful side. This is about a colonel who is nearing retirement and nearing death in Venice, recounting war stories and spending time with the girl he loves. And I'll say girl because he is 51 years old. He says it tons of times in the book, and the girl he is in love with is a 19-year-old Venetian named Renata. And yeah, I don't even know what to say about that. Actually, I do, and we'll get back to it later. Hemingway is a very conversational writer from what I understand. From only the 2 books that I've read, it seems to me he really, really likes building out conversation, and he writes sparsely. He writes really, really simple, flat prose and flat dialogue that may be hit or miss for some people. I like his prose quite a lot, and this book is no stranger to that structure, but I'm going to be completely straight with you though. About half of this book is dialogue, maybe more, but at least half of this book is dialogue between the Colonel and Renata, and their dialogue is some of the most boring stuff I've ever read. And when I say the word boring, it's not a word I use very often because I don't think it's like a fair word in many senses, because to say that I'm bored means that there's nothing holding my interest, right? And that's not usually true, because even when I read something that I find despicable, which this wasn't, but even when I read something that I find so utterly despicable that I can't stand it, I don't even usually say that I'm bored, because it's not true. Because to be bored, I have to be so ridiculously disinterested that I'm falling asleep in the middle of the day, which almost never happens to me when I'm reading personally. There's usually something I can take away from the dialogue. This verges on boring though. Let me just pick out some dialogue for you. You still love me in the cold, hard Venice light of morning. It is really cold and hard, isn't it? I love you and it is cold and hard. I loved you all night when I was skiing in the dark. How do you do that? It is the same runs except that it is dark and the snow is dark instead of light. You ski the same, controlled it good. Did you ski all night? That would be many runs. No, afterward I slept soundly and well and I woke up happy. You were with me and you were asleep like a baby. I wasn't asleep with you and I was not asleep. You're with me now, she said and held close and tight. And we are almost there. Yes. Have I told you yet properly that I love you? You told me, but tell me again. I love you, he said. Take it frontally and formally, please. I can't. That's like the dialogue for like the entire book, and it's simultaneously poignant and well written, but also it's just the same thing over and over and over again. I love you. Please don't be rough. I told you this before. Please say it again. Please tell me again. Please keep going. Renata constantly interrupts his stories. She says, tell me a war story. And then he gets like 2 sentences in and she goes, please keep going. And then he keeps going. And then 2 more sentences go by and she goes, yes, please continue. I like this. It's like, shut up. Just let him tell the story. Why is she interjecting all the time? Like, oh my God, the dialogue is sometimes poignant and beautiful and sometimes infuriating. I don't know what to say about it other than that. It's really frustrating. Not to mention the fact that he's 51 and she's 19 and he's well-traveled and he's a colonel and he's dejected and she is this 19-year-old, I believe she's a countess in the book, that for some reason loves this guy. And I'm not going to say it's impossible. People of all ages fall in love. That's fine. But the main character, the colonel, is an expat living in Italy, and he's going to Venice for some time. That's where he usually shacks up. And at the time, Hemingway, when he wrote this in, I think, 1951, he was an expat living probably in Paris, maybe somewhere different. I'm just going to say it's a little too potentially autobiographical. Him being an older writer, writing about this older colonel who is in love with a 19-year-old, it seems a little bit too like fantasy, fan fiction, author self-insert to me, and I don't really vibe with a lot of it. But that said, I think there are some really interesting and well thought out and intentioned scenes with the colonel living in Venice and kind of traveling around, and the book opens with this scene of them going duck hunting and then flashes back a couple of days and you sort of watch the last couple of days unfold to then end the book with the duck hunting. You can kind of see it coming. So I like it structurally, and there's a lot to be said about what this book is doing, right? It's talking about death. The colonel has a heart condition and he may die and drop dead at any moment, and he's sort of just seeing his life with this young woman that he loves and trying to appreciate the time together. But he's a crotchety old Texan living in Italy, and he just is who he is, right? And in that title, everyone calls him the colonel, but his name is Richard. And so the back cover says Richard Cantrell, but the 3 or 4 times they mention his name in the book, he's called Cantwell. So Cantwell in the book, Cantrell on the back cover. If you want to take it sort of symbolically, Cantwell, he can't get well, he's sick, he's old, he's infirmed, he is just trying to live out his life now. Cantrell has none of that read. I don't know which one it is. It's probably Cantwell, and the back cover probably got it wrong, but they say Cantrell twice on the back cover. Like, did the person reading this just not know? It's not like this is translated. Like, he was an American writer. He wrote this in English, so I don't know how they got that wrong. That being said, I think the depiction of Venice felt kind of flat to me. There are a couple of scenes later on in the book where he talks about being in a marketplace that felt very rich and vibrant. But a lot of the book, the surroundings of Venice and like the way he talks about it, they don't really say much. Just to throw these in, if you want a cool depiction of Venice, please read One Piece. This is just a cover kind of depicting it. There is a island in the book called Water 7 that is a beautiful depiction of Venice. So beautiful that when I went to Venice a couple of years ago, I was almost underwhelmed because it didn't live up to the potential of this fictional Venice. And another one being The Passion by Jeanette Winterson, which is one of my favorite books. I read this last year. It's about a chicken cook for Napoleon and a gambling cross-dresser living in Venice who fall in love. The way they talk about Venice in this book is stunning. Oh my gosh. The way that the characters meander through the different canals of the city, it's just so beautiful. So I would say these are interesting depictions of Venice. This is not such an interesting depiction of Venice, which is a little disappointing because for all of the dialogue and romance and build-up and ideas of death, I hoped that Venice would be depicted more interesting and beautifully. There is a cool moment earlier in the book where he's traveling over water, not quite in Venice yet, and he talks about different houses that used to be owned by famous people along the river that he's sailing across. I learned from this book that Lord Byron's full name is George Gordon Byron. I didn't know that. And there are also 2 different instances in this book where he uses the phrase "a movable feast," which I believe is the name of his autobiography, maybe posthumous. I think it was posthumous. And so I'm not sure if he actually named or titled the book himself, but I have to imagine that this is where the phrase "a movable feast" comes from. And it's sort of this idea of, you know, like, I think he likens it to, like, the Last Supper, of, like, that final meal is always getting away from you, and it's not quite, maybe this is the way I'm interpreting it, like, not quite edible, and it's always moving, and it's so beautiful, but you can't quite, like, have it, or the way you live your life has to be constantly moving, which I think fits the themes of this book quite well. I'll give it that. Also, I just wanted to point out, because I think it's funny that the spine of this book and the spine of Tove Jansson's The Summer book look remarkably similar. They both have the red with, like, blue font on them, so I just thought that was funny. There's nothing really to draw from that. So take what you will for this book. I want to read more Hemingway. I don't think this was all that strong, and probably not a great place to start if you've never read him before. And that is about all I had today. I am well into my reading for February. I've already got 2 books under my belt, and I'm on my 3rd now. Just to give a quick teaser if anyone's interested, I just read Pushkin's Evgeny Onegin and Bird by Anne Lamott, and I just started Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier. So it's already proving to be a really solid and interesting month of reading. I'm going to save these for a future video because I think I've rambled enough today, but thank you so much for stopping by. I really appreciate you spending some time with me. Let me know down in the comments below what you read in January and what was your favorite book that you've read so far this year. Thanks for stopping by. Happy reading. Bye.